it's really a work in progress rather than a finished paper. So I'll go through some of the work I've been doing on Powell's classical papers, and among these papers there are a number of documents regarding his translation of Herodotus, which is the main topic of my talk today. So translating Herodotus from Cambridge to Westminster. Powell is a well-known figure, notorious figure in British politics. I have here just listed some of his kind of biography, and I hope that some of you, I mean, although those that didn't know about Powell, maybe they had the chance to have a look at my articles, or perhaps the beginning of my YouTube video that Jan has kindly shared with you. So we'll go straight through these facts here. So classical scholar first, a private, and at the beginning of the war, and a brigadier at the end, and then elected MP in 1950, which he basically kept until 1987. While a classical scholar, so from 1930 to 39, he managed to publish all these books that you see below, these editions actually, and books. And there is one book that he did not manage to publish, which is his translation of Herodotus in 2 volumes. It appeared eventually in 1949. Now, this is here is the Churchill Archive Centre in Cambridge, where the material that I'm going to explore today is preserved. So I'll go through a few things here. So the genesis of the translation, what happened before this publication in 49. I'll then talk about the content. And eventually I have chosen a couple of examples of this, actually one passage from this translation, and which is significant, but I have not chosen it just because it is significant, but mainly because actually at the moment I do not have the translation itself, so the book itself, and I looked at it months ago, then now, without the translation itself, I asked a colleague from Newcastle to send me pictures of specific passages. So I'll discuss one passage, which is just, I think, quite telling for many reasons. In any case, the genesis of the translation. So this is what he states in the preface. He began the translation while still a schoolboy. Then he resumed the work in 1938 after having published and worked on Herodotus, on his text, on the lexicon of Herodotus, and on many articles, published many articles on textual criticism of the Herodotian histories. He actually stopped working on the translation in September 39 because of the war, and he writes in the preface, "Never, as I suppose, to be resumed." But then in 46, after the war, when he was back in London and working in politics, he resumed the work once again and completed it in 48 with eventual publication in 49. Among the papers of Powell in Cambridge, there are a number of rejection letters. I have listed them here, which show. So you see, he was very young when he tried to publish it with various editors. The most telling one is actually the one, the letter from the Clarendon Press, which says, I quote here, "I'm afraid that at present there is no place in our plans for such a translation, and I'm not sure that we are altogether convinced that biblical English is what Herodotus demands." We'll come back to this biblical English, of course. So among others, Clarendon Press refused publication. But then among the papers, the classical papers of Powell, you can find a few letters from the late 1938, from December, basically, where Kenneth Sisam and Powell exchange a number of letters, and we find out that they met on December 2, 1938. They discussed the possibility of publishing Powell's translation of Herodotus. Then I have here, so Kenneth Sisam was the assistant secretary to the delegates at the time. We'll come back to Sisam as well. So a letter from the 5th December 38 says, following our conversation last Friday, I am now communicating, writing that I intend to send you the manuscript of my Herodotus translation. This is Powell writing to Sisam. The translation ready for press, and he continues by saying that he should deliver it by June, and in the first installment, and then the last one in November of 1939. Back to the letters. The letter from October 19, 1939 that Powell wrote to Kenneth Sisam once he had come back from Sydney, where he was professor of Greek and was ready to be enlisted in the army. He says, "Dear Sisam, I regret to inform you that having today enlisted in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, I shall not be able to carry out the remainder of my undertaking to the press with regard to my translation of Herodotus." The second third of the work was already on the outbreak of war, but I trust the delegates will be prepared to accept this and the remainder as soon after my eventual demobilization as I can have them ready. So he was going to the war and was not really sure that he was coming back, actually. Briefly on Kenneth Sisam, if anyone is not familiar with this figure, very important figure of Oxford University, Clarendon Press, actually, in the first half of the 20th century. He was born in New Zealand, then went to Merton College in Oxford with a Rhodes Scholarship. He was an Anglo-Saxon scholar and became assistant secretary at Oxford University Press from 1925. It is curious that he failed to obtain the chair of Anglo-Saxon, which went eventually to Tolkien. Elected to the British Academy in 1941, he then became secretary to the delegates in 1942. He retired from this position in 1948. There are a number of publications in classical studies that owe very much to Kenneth Sisam, and this has been highlighted, for example, by Mortimer Chambers in the Genesis of Jacobi Satis, and also in a very recent book, The Ark of Civilization, Refugee Scholars and Oxford University. So what happened after the war? The correspondence with Sisam resumes, so the Powell papers preserve these correspondence, especially on the first one is from 8 April 1946, when Powell writes to the Oxford Clarendon Press to request a meeting with Sisam next Saturday. And at this time, his address is Conservative Parliamentary Secretariat. On the same day, Daniel Davin replies to Powell, "Dear Powell," I quote here, "Sisam is away until 11 April, but I think I can say in advance that he would not be able to see you on Saturday, 13 April, since he's not usually here on Saturdays." Then he goes on and he recalls meeting Powell in Cairo in 1942. Eventually, Sisam writes on May 1st, 1946, "Dear Powell, I was delighted to hear from you again when I got back from a very pleasant holiday. And Maas," which is of course Paul Maas, who was working at the press at the time and was in Oxford, thanks to Powell, "had kept me informed to some extent of your changing life, which has left, I gather, some interest still in Herodotus." And then there are some 60 letters or so between Powell, Davin, and Sisam. And one of these includes Powell's letter where he says that his translation should be ready for press at the end of May in 1947. I don't know if it might be possible for Mas to be put on this job, but if it should prove so, I am sure that would be to the benefit of Herodotus as well as a joy to both of us. Here is also a briefly on Devin, who was also a very important figure in Oxford in the post-war period. He was, besides being a publisher and a very important one, you see at the end there is a quotation from Stalworthy: his mastery of the arts of friendship as much as his intellectual attainments made him the greatest academic publisher of his time. He was also a writer of novels, collections of short stories and non-fiction works. Now, as I was saying, there are almost 60 letters regarding the publication of Herodotus' translation. There are many issues that come up. I won't go, of course, through all of these. Summary here, so both Sisam and especially Davin later on, they complain about the too many corrections that Powell included in the proofs at different stages of their, between 1947 and 48. There is difficult, it comes up frequently also, the difficult working conditions of the press, due to rationing. The lack of paper is also very important, of course, and the lack of expert staff. And there is the nature and the place of the critical appendix that was included in the translation eventually, but has a very complicated story, and Mas's role in the preparation, not only for the publication itself and the translation, but also for the critical appendix. Paul Mas, and these are often, almost always, they focus on specific passages in Herodotus. Here is one letter that I would like to quote, where Powell writes to Davin: dear Davin, I went along to see Mas after I left you on last Friday, and I confess that he put the critical apparatus in a light in which I had not been seeing it. I had regarded it as nothing more than a defense against charges of inaccurate translation. He showed me that it is in fact an independent critical apparatus without the text. So this critical apparatus, which was added at the end of the translation, was at that point. At that point, Powell actually found out, thanks to Mas, that it was an important and independent critical apparatus. Then we have also letters where Sisam and Davin proposed that he insert the critical apparatus in the next edition of the OCT of Herodotus. But this never happened, actually. Here are a couple of things on the final arrangements for the publication. So in August 48, Sisam agrees to insert this critical appendix in the translation and not in the OCT of Herodotus. And then adds, and this is just quite a nice letter, and for myself, I hope that your political preoccupations will not prevent you from coming to Oxford from time to time, and perhaps sparing a little time from the zenith of the British Empire for the rise of the Athenian. So eventually the book is published in June. The book was published actually on 14 July 1949, and we have all these letters that testify to this. One of the last letters, September 49, there is Powell who talks about this possibility of publishing an OCT edition, but actually at the beginning of 1950 he got his seat in Parliament, and he never managed to do any more work on Herodotus. So the content of the translation, for those unfamiliar with it, is basically, of course, the whole translation is preceded by an introduction, where Powell actually restates what he had already published in his 39 book, The History of Herodotus. So he argued for a different compositional phases A first one where the author focused on Persia and the Persian Empire, which was published, according to Powell, around 448, 442 BCE. And after the foundation of Turi, Herodotus enlarged his history to the Greek West and Anatolia and Asia Minor. Powell also conjectured that Herodotus may have died of plague at Athens in 1429. The introduction also includes a critical review of previous English translation, and one reviewer said, Mr. Powell does not distribute ducats to his predecessors, which is usually true also of other works and prefaces by Powell. The one I've chosen here is from the History of Herodotus of 1939, where he says, I care more about the soundness than the novelty of my reasoning and conclusions. Acknowledgement to predecessors is rare. I have besides profited much more often from their mistakes than their successes, which is quite telling of the character. Now, to the English translation that Powell managed to publish, it is based on, the language is based on the authorized version of the Bible, so King James Bible. And he says that it has a certain quaintness and archaism, which makes an impression, quote, not dissimilar from that which the Ionic original must have made upon Attic readers in the 20s of the 5th century BCE. Of course, the Bible, as you know very well and much better than I do, was the one commissioned by King James in 1604 and published in 1611. The edition that is actually standard today, largely in use today, is the Oxford edition of 1769. And it is interesting that Powell was brought up with this English translation, but also with the Greek text of the New Testament. And this is testified by, at the beginning of his biography by Simon Heffer. He says that his mother saw Jack, which is John actually, as he was known at home, Jack's education as her first duty. Such was her own thirst for learning that she had taught herself Greek, using the New Testament as her primer. She had a phenomenal knowledge of the Bible, and this relation to the Bible, to the text of the Bible, is also attested by the publication, The Evolution of the Gospel by Powell in 1994. So at the end of his life, he came back to the text of the Bible and published. Well, this is, I think, the last book he published. Now to the Critical Appendix. So it is included in volume 2 at the very end. And on page 3, Powell writes, the first duty of the translator is to be intelligible. And while taking as my basis the text of Carl Hude in the Bibliotheca Ausoniensis, I have not hesitated, whenever intelligibility demanded it, to use my own emendations or those of others, which will be found noted in the Critical Appendix. And then at the beginning of the Critical Appendix itself, I have singled out, put in bold, the sentence, where no authority for a reading is given, it is a conjectural emendation by the translator. And actually, from the letters, it emerges how much Maas contributed to the Critical Appendix. They discussed various passages in Herodotus and how what the best solution would be. And it is also telling that Nigel Wilson's OCT of Herodotus made ample use of both these letters, but especially of Powell's Critical Appendix. And he wrote that they have received much less attention than they deserve. And this, the translation itself, the translation by Powell and the Critical Appendix, were also used by Vannicelli and Aldo Corcella in their Italian edition of Herodotus, Book 7. I have singled out 4 reviewers here just to see what were the reactions to this translation in the early 50s. And we have Edward Forster expressing his views on the Journal of Hellenic Studies. He says this translation is undoubtedly the best which has yet appeared in English. It gives the impression of being accurate, scholarly, and eminently readable. Then there is Finch in Classical World. He also mentioned its smooth-flowing imitation of the language of King James Bible. And even though he has some remarks on specific passages and some choices that Powell made, he believes that it is a good translation. Karl Rubach in Classical Philology writes, the result is an unusually accurate translation with due regard for later editions by Herodotus and for interpolations. And we'll see that later on. So, and finally, I have also singled out Pierre Chantren's review in Revue de Philologie. He also, even though not an expert, because English was not his mother tongue, of course, he believes that the translation is exact. You see the last sentence that I've quoted. So generally, quite good translations, quite good reviews, with no complaints about the English, actually. And I have here reported one case, one passage that will show the style of this translation, and then I'll compare it to some other translation on specific passages. So this is Xerxes and Demaratus and the dialogue, the beginning of the second dialogue in 7:101-1-3, where Xerxes asked about Demaratus. I'll read Powell's translation. Demaratus, now it is my pleasure to ask of thee certain things that I would. Thou art a Greek, and of no mean or feeble city, as I learn from thee and from the other Greeks that have communed with me. Now, therefore, declare unto me whether the Greeks will abide my coming and lift up their hands against me. For, as I deem, though all the Greeks and the residue that dwell to the westward were gathered together, they should not be sufficient to abide my own coming. How much less if they be not united? Howbeit, I desire to know thy answer also, what manners of thing thou wilt say concerning them. Thus Xerxes asked, and Demaratus answered and said, O king, shall I observe the truth to thee words or thy pleasure? So this is these are the other translations that I had access to, actually, because of closing of libraries and so on. So I was not able to check a fairly high number of translations, and I have here checked some of the specific passages in the passage that I just read, which shows I think the precision of Powell's translation in this instance, and that should work for the whole of his translation. So it is especially interesting in the use of in the first line. In the Greek says, ton allon elenon, ton emoi es logus apikneomenon. This is Huda's text, and also Wilson's and Corcella's and so on. And Powell translates, as I learned from thee and from the other Greeks that have communed with me. This communed is actually, he reports, is the translation of a changed text, because this is reported in the Critical Appendix, and he uses, instead of apikneomenon, so the present participle, he uses the aorist participle apikomenon, and thus translates. While if we look at the other translations in English, the Loeb one and the Penguin one, you'll find that they use the present, they use the past as well, but the past tense, but they did not, they translated actually a present participle. So it is, I think, more precise, even though it doesn't change much, of course. Then we have the other one, the next line, nunon moitode phrason e Hellenes hupemeneusi heiras emoi antaeromenoi. He says, now therefore declare unto me whether the Greeks will abide my coming and lift up their hands against me. So we have abide my coming, which where he translates the verb upomeno, and heiras antaeiro. While in the other translations that I've checked, this is not so strongly represented. Then the third line, Udei pantes Hellenes kai oiloi poi oikros esperes oikeontis anthropoi sulektheisan. Powell translates, though for as I deem, though all the Greeks and the residue that dwell to the westward were gathered together. So he translates this oiloi poi, while in the rest of the translations it is not so exact. It is with the other or with nothing at all in the Loeb's translation. This again, this is not, I think, a mistake, just a more precise. And the last one also, this where Xerxes asked Demaratus what he thinks about the Spartans, and then Demaratus answered, Basileu kotera letheie kresomai prose e done. So, O king, shall I observe the truth to thee words or thy pleasure? And in the Loeb translation, there is no reference, for example, to the beginning of this short passage, so to Xerxes, omentauta erota, but simply to this question, Demaratus answered, O king, should I speak the truth or try to please you? Sorry. So in Powell's translation, I observe the truth. Shall I observe the truth? Translates more exactly, resomai aletheia, then should I speak the truth, perhaps? And then the Penguin translation gives simply, King, Demaratus replied, is it a true answer you would like or a pleasant one? So this is just one example of many that we could single out, perhaps, within the translation that Powell made. Here instead, I've chosen another passage that comes up immediately after the one that I've just discussed regarding the translation. And so this is from 7:102:1, where Demaratus is talking to Xerxes, and he talks about the poverty of the Greeks. He says, here is Powell's translation, perhaps I should read the one by Godley. In Hellas, poverty is always endemic, but courage is acquired as the fruit of wisdom and strong law. The might of the law. By use of this courage, Hellas defends herself from poverty and tyranny. So here, even though Paulus translates this passage, he excludes it. He believes it to be a later addition, which possibly not by Herodotus. This is in one of the footnotes. So he believed it to be an interpolation. And in fact, if we check the other instances where Herodotus uses poverty to show that the country is not worthy of conquest, it is a different kind of poverty, and it's only in some instances it is also an incentive to kind of military prowess. And this comes in 171 and also in 122. In this case, however, Demaratus argues that the initial endemic poverty is superseded by wisdom and the law, and this avoids not only poverty but also tyranny. And actually, if we follow Powell and believe that the sentence is an interpolation, if taken out, it doesn't change the general sense of the whole chapter and what Demaratus is trying to say. But it perhaps this should not be considered an interpolation, and it hasn't actually been considered such by later editors. Another clue to the fact that it is perhaps not a later interpolation is the fact that it appears that actually the word tendes posunen appears in the Anti-Atticista, the lexicon, Atticistic lexicon of the 1st, 2nd century AD, and it quotes precisely Herodotus book 7. So if it is an interpolation, it must have occurred at a earlier date than the 1st, 2nd century AD, but it is very unlikely. So here we have what I would say would be a mistake by Powell to consider this an interpolation. So I will not linger anymore on this translation, but come to my conclusions. And I believe this is an interesting topic to study, because we have here 3 different layers. So, of course, Herodotus' Greek, of King James Bible, and Powell's translation. And there is much more that I, of course, need to do and that I could do in the near future. The one is perhaps to have a look at the English, at the language of the English Bible. And I have found out yesterday, reading Simon Goldhill's review of Liddell and Scott in Bryn Mawr Classical Review, that there is a book on the social universe of the English Bible by Naomi Tadmor, which shows that basic terms were deeply ideological, the basic terms chosen to translate the English Bible. So perhaps there is, one could check for clues for Powell's own interpretations of the text, let's say his ideology that emerged from the translation, so focusing possibly on political keywords, on perhaps geographical descriptions, or even emotions of some of the characters, and of course the additions and interpolations by checking especially the Critical Appendix. In any case, the translation shows a very interesting approach, in my opinion, to the text of Herodotus, because it focuses both on style and clarity. It is, as far as I can tell, very readable and pleasant, but eventually it is up to each reader to judge the utility of such an endeavor. It is also, I think, a remarkable feat that it is very precise in its closeness to the Greek original, without being too strict or dull. And finally, the letters that I have partially here presented here display this winding genesis of the book from the 1930s, when Powell tried to publish it with various publishers, to its eventual publication in 1949, and it could be a part of the history of Oxford University Press. And especially interesting, I think, is the Critical Appendix, which has been used with great profit by recent editors of Herodotus, and it shows not only Powell's endeavor, but also Paul Bass' contribution to its publication. Thank you very much, and I'm open, of course, to questions and all sorts of criticism.